Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mykola Veresin.
За допомогою Софії. Софія – це така людина, яку ви зараз не бачите. Може, вона потім з'явиться. Вона перекладачка. А говорити ми
Today we are going to talk with William Felix Browder, or Bill Browder, an international financier, a man who is known and all over Russia. He is one of the most ardent and persistent fighter against Russian corruption and against Putin. He has been doing this for many years. He is an American, but he also a British passport. We will talk with him about money and Putin. It seems to me that Putin's pseudonym, Putin's war, is still money, and he even starts war to earn some money.
Отже, я починаю своє інтерв'ю, і в кінці, і може і на початку, я щось ще поясню про те, що ви зараз побачите. Доброго здоров'я, пан
Greetings, Mr. Browder. Thank you for finding time for us. I would like to advertise your book, Freezing Order. This is a new book by Mr. Browder, which is freely available for
яка
Ukrainians.
безкоштовно для українців. Ми побачимо обов'язково на екрані, вам висвітиться, яким чином можна знайти цю книжку. Опір путінському режиму.
The man who started his resistance back in 2006. Also, his other book, Red Notice, has already been published. There is a book about money, laundering in Russia and the fight against Putinism.
Про боротьбу з путінізмом. Це всі
And they are definitely
книжки,
worth
які
reading.
варто прочитати. І моє перше запитання, пане Браудер.
Mr. Browder, the
перше
first question
дуже
is quite
філософічне
philosophical.
запитання. А можна
Can
вилікувати
Russia be
Росію?
cured?
Well, I think that there's a famous expression that the fish rots from the head, and Vladimir Putin is a criminal. He's a financial criminal. He's a murderer. He's a mafia boss, and so as long as you have a person like him in charge, there's no chance that Russia can be cured. But I think Georgia, the country of Georgia, now it's for any country. I remember when I first went to Russia back in the early 1990s, Georgia was considered to be the most corrupt country in the former Soviet Union. And after Mikhail Saakashvili came in, he fired all the traffic policemen, fired all the tax inspectors, replaced everybody with people in their 20s and 30s. And Georgia went from being one of the most corrupt countries in the world to being a much less corrupt country. And so I think that is sort of the model, which is that if for some reason Russia could possibly end up with an honest leader, then that honest leader could potentially clean up this ugly cesspool of criminality that permeates every part of Russia.
Yes, but дивіться, але один раз людство
But once humanity, and you as a part of this humanity, believes in Russia.
Ви приїхали в Росію в 90 там якомусь році.
You came there in 1996, believing in Russia that the change were irreversible, and you said, I will work here.
Я буду тут працювати. І потім прийшов Путін.
Then Putin came and everything changed.
Коли ми кажемо, що
When we say that Saakashvili made reforms for Georgia, okay. But now the American government warns Georgia that the reforms are either very slow or reversible. So what should humanity do, not only Bill Browder? Once again, believe in the possibility of reincarnation of Russia, because everything can change for better as well as for worse.
Well, to be honest, I'm not very hopeful right now. I look at the situation, and I see that Vladimir Putin he understands that if he is ever to lose power, then he would end up going to jail, losing his money, and probably losing his life. And so he's going to hold on to power in every possible way. And then you also have these other oligarchs and officials, corrupt officials, and their wealth and their status and their safety is all guaranteed by the current Putin system. So people there that are going to try to keep this thing going for a very long time, and they have a lot of resources to do it. They have huge money that they've stolen over the last 22 years. In fact, I would estimate that Vladimir Putin and the 1,000 people around him have stolen $1 trillion, $1,000 billion from the Russian state in a 22-year period. And so they've got huge resources to try to keep the regime going. And so I'm not hopeful, but I also understand that Putin has way overextended himself by launching this war against Ukraine. He's completely losing the war right now. So many Russian troops have died, 67,000, I believe. They've lost an enormous amount of equipment, and he's in a position where if the Ukrainians were to win this war, the Russian people may say enough is enough. We don't want a loser as our president. And it could easily be a situation. I wouldn't put a high probability on it, but it could be a situation where the Putin regime collapses under its own weight. And if it collapses, then the question is, who picks up the pieces? And there's possibilities, either another Putin type of character, or maybe the whole system collapses to such an extent that nobody wants any of these Putin type of characters, and they want somebody, some Democrat, some reformer, somebody who wants to fix Russia. I don't put a high probability on the good scenario, but that is a possibility because Putin has so overextended himself and made such a fatal error in invading Ukraine.
The last question from this block, then we will talk about your book. A simple and a complicated question, I think. You personally, if some Navalny or some opponent, critics of Putin, with the slogans of democracy, human rights, private property comes to power, will you come to Russia and start helping again? Of course, all investors help themselves, but they do also help Russia. Will you return to Russia? Is it possible to imagine?
Well, I would never go back as an investor in Russia. Those days are over for me. My activity now is as a human rights and justice activist. And I hope that one day when if Russia ever comes back to normal, that I could go back and I could be there at the opening of a monument to celebrate Sergei Magnitsky, my lawyer, who was murdered by the Russian for uncovering a Putin corruption scheme. I'd like to go back and unveil that monument. And I'd like to go back and make sure that the people who killed him are finally prosecuted and brought to justice. And I'd like to go back and see that other people who are involved in the genocide against Ukraine are brought to justice. But I don't see that I'm ever going to be an investor in that country again.
Let's turn to your new book, Freezing Order, Resistance to the Putin Regime. I will remind our viewers that it is free in Ukraine and in Russia. Also, I think that in Russia they will do everything to make sure that, despite its free access, it is not Sin B anymore. But what is the difference between this book and the previous one, which has a similar title in Ukrainian, Red Notice, Confronting the Putin Regime? What is the difference?
So this book, the English title of this book is Freezing Order. My previous book was called Red Notice in English. Just quickly for everybody, if you want to get it free, you can go to www.billbrowder.com and you can download it for free in Ukrainian language or in Russian language. This book is all about my attempts to find money, the $230 million that my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, exposed. This was a crime, a government crime he exposed. We wanted to find that money and make sure that the people who got that money had that money frozen by law enforcement, which is why the book in English is called Freezing Order. And it's all about our attempts to find that money and where we found that money. We found some of that money going to Vladimir Putin. And the book is written like a detective story. So it's not a boring book. It's a very exciting book, but it really shows you, it lifts the hood, and it shows you how Vladimir Putin launders money and tries to kill anybody who exposes him. And I think it's a very important book for Ukrainians to read, because there's a lot of, the Russians are going to have to pay for the rebuilding of Ukraine. And this gives you a roadmap and an idea of how to go after their money. And so it's, I think, an important book certainly for the Ukrainian leaders to read, but I think for everybody in Ukraine to read.
A question and explanation for our audience. I will not say that I constantly follow your story, but I know you and your case, and the case of Magnitsky, and I even know Vladimir Pastukhov, who now lives in London. He is my good friend and a very good analyst. And here is the question and explanation. The story of Mr. Browder is that he and his lawyers, assistants, his friends, saw that according to various estimates, $230 million were stolen from the budget of the Russia. We know that Putin considers the Russian budget his own pocket.
Російської Федерації своєю власною кишенею. І ви виконали роботу.
You and your lawyers have done the job of the FSB.
ФСБ. Вони знайшли крадіїв всіх грошей.
You found the thieves of this money and made this information public. That is, these people who made public the information that at least $230 million were stolen from Putin's pocket, these people were imprisoned and killed there. There is some illogical here. Please explain what you think about Putin's psychology when he learned about this, and I'm sure he knows your story and you as a personal enemy. What does he think? What is the essence of it? Money was stolen from my pocket, someone helps me find it, and I do not imprison by culprit, but the one who helped me find him. This is some kind of absurdity. What can you say about what is the Putin's mind?
Well, so this was the absurdity of my whole story. So back in 2007, my offices were raided in Moscow. The police seized all of our documents, and then the documents were used in a very complicated fraud in which we had paid $230 million of taxes to the Russian government, and that the police, after seizing the documents, working with a bunch of corrupt officials and criminals, stole the $230 million. And we thought Putin, this is not our money, this was the Russian government's money. And we thought Putin is a nationalist. He might not be a nice guy, he might not be an honest guy, but he's a nationalist who we thought he was a patriot, that he would be very upset if he learned that his own officials had stolen $230 million of the Russian government's money. And so we publicized the fraud. We exposed it. Sergei Magnitsky testified against the officials involved. And then we sat back and waited for the good guys to get the bad guys. But it turns out that in Putin's Russia, there are no good guys. Instead of arresting the people who committed the fraud, they arrested the person who reported the fraud, Sergei Magnitsky. And then they tortured him in prison for 358 days to try to get him to recant his testimony and to say that he had stolen the $230 million and had done so on my instruction. And Sergei was a man of incredible integrity, and he refused. And the torture got worse and worse and worse. He lost a bunch of weight. He lost about 20 kilos. He was diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation. They refused him all medical treatment. And then on the night of November 16, 2009, he went into critical condition. Instead of treating him, they put him in an isolation cell, chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him until he died. He was 37 years old. This was 13 years ago. And once we publicized all this to the world, Putin had an opportunity to prosecute the people who were involved, but instead he promoted them and gave them state honors. And we always scratched our heads and said, why is Putin being such a low-level criminal here? Why doesn't he do the right thing? And we discovered the answer in 2017 when the Panama Papers were exposed. The Panama Papers was a data leak from a Panamanian law firm where a lot of Russians did business. And we discovered from the Panama Papers that Putin had a man who was a trustee or a proxy. His name was Sergei Roldugin. And he had received $2 billion. He was a cellist from St. Petersburg. He had received $2 billion of money from oligarchs and Russian state banks. And everyone knew that this man was Putin's best friend from childhood. He was the godfather of Putin's daughter. He was the person who introduced Putin to his wife. And he was an active financial trustee for Vladimir Putin. So the most important thing is that we discovered that Roldugin, the cellist from St. Petersburg, received some of the money from the $230 million that Sergei Magnitsky was killed over. And so what does that mean? That means very simply that Putin received that money. And it explains why Putin has acted like such a criminal here, and explains why he did all these things that seem to be against the Russian interest, because he was the one benefiting from this. And so to come back to the original question, so the money was stolen from the Russian government, and then the money was given to Vladimir Putin. And so in very simple terms, Vladimir Putin was stealing from his government. And the most important part of my book and my the insights that I've had over the last 13 years fighting with Putin is that this Magnitsky crime was one of 1,000 similarly sized crimes. So the amount of money that we can identify that Putin stole wasn't $230 million. It was $234 billion. And we found this money that was laundered through Danske Bank in Estonia. And I think this explains a lot about why Putin is behaving the way he's behaving. Because I don't believe that he started this war in Ukraine because he has anything against Ukrainians. I think he started this war because he's scared of the Russian people rising up from stealing, and he needs a foreign enemy. And that's why he started this war, was because he needed to cover up for his stealing.
That is an interesting reflection, and maybe it is true that partly at least Putin started the war against Ukraine to hide this stealing.
Але ось моє питання. Як ви думаєте?
But do you believe that one day all these crimes will be solved?
Колись всі ці злочини можна буде розкрити. Чому виникає це питання?
Why such a question? Putin is an KGBist.
Ці люди дуже гарно
These people are very good at hiding everything they do.
що вони роблять. У них є величезний
They have a huge experience, starting with Lenin.
І коли ми говоримо, що
And when we say that something happened in prison,
думаю, що вже і
there may be no witness left anymore because they were all killed.
А може навіть тих офіцерів,
And maybe
які
even
били
those
пана
officers who had beaten Mr. Magnitsky were also killed.
І просто коли
And when we dream, as many Ukrainians dream, that Putin's regime will collapse and the truth about what happened in Russia during these years will finally be relieved.
знання, з'явилися знання, що відбувалося в Росії в ці роки. Але ми також
But we also know about the experience of the NKVD, KGB, FSB to hide all this.
Чи можемо ми розраховувати,
Can we
що
expect that Scotland Yard,
або
FBI,
ФБР
Interpol or all together will be able to find or at least specify point of the guilty ones in these crimes.
На людей, які винні в цих кримінальних злочинах.
Well, I wish that this was the case. So I've spent the last 13 years since Sergei Magnitsky was murdered, tracking the money myself, and then sharing these insights with law enforcement agencies all over the world, with the FBI, with British police, with the French police, with the Spanish police, with everybody. And what I've discovered is that in some cases I've been able to get investigation. In many cases, the countries don't want to investigate. And just to give you an example, UK, where I live, since Vladimir Putin came to power 22 years ago, there has not been a prosecution or investigation of Russian economic crime. And this is the most used country. This is the country with the most dirty money from Russia coming through it, and there hasn't been a single incident. And I think that that's a real problem, because in order to rebuild Ukraine, it's going to require a lot of money. And the first place that money should come from is the Russian money. And there's a lot of Russian money out there, but we haven't had any success so far in the world. Countries haven't had any success in putting together proper seizures and freezing of that money. And that's one of I think the biggest challenges going forward is to where is that money to freeze it and to seize it and to use it to rebuild Ukraine.
And my last question is more for a reflection than a question. Now Ukraine is fighting with Russia. Ukrainian soldiers are dying. The whole Ukrainian is helping the front. Thank God we have friends in Europe, in the USA, in Canada, in Japan. But your example shows the difference between the West and the East. Bill Browder, seeing injustice, began to look for the truth and found this truth in the US Parliament, in the parliaments of many countries. That is, the biblical knock and it shall be open unto you come true on the example of Bill Browder, and did not come true, for example, of Sergei Magnitsky. This is what the Ukrainian people are fighting for.
За що борються, це я для людей українських, які це побачать. За що бореться український народ?
This is what the Ukrainian people are fighting for.
Людьми, які важко.
Yes, it's hard, it takes years, and you see that Mr. Browder criticized some Western governments for doing nothing or doing not enough. But still he has succeeded. He published books, going to different organizations, talked to senators, congressmen, deputies, and the certain success. If he did it at Magnitsky, did in Russia, he would have been killed. And this is the difference. This is what the Ukrainian people are fighting for, to be able to search for the truth and to find it, and not for the Russian people or the Russian president is fighting for. That no truth can ever be found. Do you agree?
It's really important that the truth is what sunlight is the best disinfectant. That shining a bright light on everything is what causes the world to change. And I think that probably one of the reasons why Ukraine has so successfully stood up to so much of a more well-equipped neighbor is because your leader, Vladimir Zelensky, is a communicator, and he's done on a much larger scale what I've been doing for the last 13 years. Is every day he's giving presentations and conversations and speeches to parliaments and governments and law enforcement bodies and so on all over the world. And so everybody understands what's going on, and this is really crucial. And of course, underneath him, there are many people in the Ukrainian government doing the same thing, and this is the key. It's all about not letting the fake narrative overcome the true narrative. And it's very interesting because I see a lot of the Russian disinformation operations. I see them before, and I've seen them now, and they're trying to tell a completely different story about what's going on in Ukraine, and that story doesn't work in the West. But they continue to repeat it, and they repeat it and repeat it, and that's what they did with me. They said that Sergei Magnitsky wasn't he wasn't murdered, he wasn't tortured, he wasn't a whistleblower. They went around and repeated it and repeated and repeated, and it was only because I had the energy and ability and contacts to go and tell the truth that people believe my side of the story. And Ukraine is going to have to do the same thing, which is to constantly repeat what the truth is, to expose the lies, and to continue to expose the lies as they're being formulated by the Russians, because this is their whole modus operandi, is to lie and lie and lie. And if they just repeat it enough times, hope that people will believe them.
The end. Thank you, Mr. Bill Browder. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and good luck.
Thank you.